Hi, everybody. Good to have you all here tonight. We'll be starting shortly here. Thanks for joining us, whether on Zoom or on our first attempt at YouTube live stream. Okay. Okay. It's great to be here with you all tonight for our fourth Universalist Food Justice panel on food insecurity and hunger in New York City. I have just a few quick housekeeping items of rules to discuss with you all. So give just a second, I will pull that up so that everybody can see it. So tonight's event will be streamed live and recorded for posting online, and we will have a time for questions during the Q&A portion at the end of the event. Attendees will be muted unless you're asking a question, and we can also have you ask questions in the chat box as well that we'll be paying attention to. We have a couple folks keeping an eye on the chat box if you have any urgent questions. But it's wonderful to have you here, and we are very excited for this event and to get to hear from a lot of great speakers. And I'm going to take this screen off for you. I think you guys got the rules now. Okay. So even before COVID-19 hit, which has been quite a big shake to 2020, New York City was already grappling with a food insecurity crisis. Nearly 1.2 million New Yorkers were experiencing food insecurity, including 1 in 5 New York City children. With the pandemic and a little economic crisis that followed, the situation has only gotten worse. 1.5 million New Yorkers are now struggling to feed themselves and their families, a 38% increase. 1 in 4 children are now food insecure, a 49% increase over pre-COVID numbers. Not surprisingly, the food insecurity crisis disproportionately impacts Black and Latinx communities. According to a recent City University New York study, the proportion of New Yorkers who worry about their households running out of food before they can buy more is twice as high for Latinx as for white city residents and 1.4 times as high for Black as white residents. Across the nation, the pandemic has only worsened food apartheid, conditions that exist for nearly 24 million Americans. The pandemic has highlighted inequities and environmental racism throughout our food system that we will be discussing more tonight. Not just hunger in our community, but in terms of the entire food chain. A recent study shows that white people comprised over 97% of non-farming landowners, 96% of owner-operators, and 86% of tenant operators. And that systemic racism is also found in communities of color when it comes to finding healthy food. Black families are 2.5 times, and Latinx families are 1.4 times more likely than white families to live in neighborhoods without access to a full-service grocery store. Our guests are working across our food system, from activism and farming to research and policy. And to begin, we'll look at the current state of hunger and poverty in New York City. Sophie Coyer is Research Director at the Center on Poverty and Social Policy at Columbia University. Her research focuses on anti-poverty policies at the national and local levels, with a particular interest in child allowances, federal and local minimum wage policy, and housing policy. Coyer works at the Poverty Tracker, a joint project of Robin Hood and Columbia University that is a quarterly survey of adults in New York City for tracking dynamics of poverty, hardship, and other forms of wealth and disadvantage. In November, Coyer and her colleagues released a study on food hardship in New York City in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, which is what she'll discuss with us tonight. So Sophie, thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much, and thanks so much for having me. I'm really grateful to be here and looking forward to the discussion and the presentations from Karen and Liz. I'm going to share my screen and hope it works. I will present results and from an analysis that we did using data from as Ember was mentioned, the poverty tracker, which is a longitudinal study of poverty and material hardship and disadvantage in New York City that we run out of Columbia and is run through a joint partnership with Robin Hood. So I'll quickly provide, an introduction to the poverty tracker study, which will help understand where these results come from, and then show our results, our approach to assessing the impacts of the pandemic on both food hardship and food pantry use in New York City. Some key findings, I'll discuss the key findings from our analysis, as well as some of the policy implications. Oh, okay. So a quick overview of the poverty tracker. It's a longitudinal study of poverty, disadvantage, and well-being in New York City that's been actually in the field since 2012. And what makes it longitudinal is it's not that we just capture data at one point in time and then kind of leave it. We work with the same families and households for up to 4 years, assessing both the amount of material hardship they're facing, which is things like, as we're discussing, food hardship and inability to afford enough food for the month, as well as falling behind on rent and facing evictions, as well, and not being able to see a doctor because of cost. So there are lots of different material hardships that we measure in addition to measuring income poverty to get a more holistic understanding of the challenges that New Yorkers are facing. We also measure health and understand, what share of New Yorkers are facing a work-limiting health condition or report that they're in poor health. So every 3 months, we interview a representative sample of New Yorkers, kind of tracking trends in some of these measures, as well as a number of others measures of economic stability and disadvantage. So I'll quickly discuss our approach to assessing the impacts of the pandemic on food hardship and pantry use. So in every month from November 2019 to October 2020, our surveys asked a representative sample of New Yorkers, in the past 12 months, how often did you worry whether food would run out before you had enough money to buy more? And how often did the food you purchased not last and you weren't able to buy more? These two questions form the basis of a food hardship measure, which is somewhat similar to a food insecurity measure, but there are some differences that we can discuss later. But food hardship is defined as sometimes or often running out of food or worrying food would run out before you had enough money to buy more. We also asked, which is there's very little data actually at the city level on pantry use. And so we ask our respondents, in the past 12 months, did you receive free food from a church, food bank, or food pantry? And with a yes/no response. So our approach, these questions form the basis of the results presented in our most recent report on food pantry use and food hardship in the city and how it's changed dramatically since the COVID outbreak. So here are some of our key findings, which I dive into. So the first, and this kind of echoes what Ember was saying, is that food hardship and insecurity has been a widespread problem in New York City for years. So these results are from before the pandemic, where we see that overall about 36% of adults in the city face food hardship, and that more than half of Black and Latino New Yorkers face food hardship compared to about 15% of white New Yorkers. So extremely stark disparities along racial and ethnic lines that, as we know, are really the product of structural forces that are perpetuating these inequities. We also see variations by immigration status, as well as educational attainment. This is just a map showing the variations in food hardship across the city. So there are areas of the city that are marked in red where upwards of 60% of adult residents faced some form of food hardship over the course of a year. So sharp disparities across the city. But there were, prior to the pandemic, while there were high rates of food hardship, fewer people reported using a food pantry. So about 12% of New Yorkers, adult New Yorkers, reported using a food pantry. But since March, things have changed dramatically. In this graph, we show the changes in the rates of food pantry use from November to September and October of this year. So food pantry use has skyrocketed. We've seen about a 300% or a 3 times increase in the rate of food pantry use among New Yorkers. And when we look at rates of pantry use among New Yorkers who are receiving SNAP benefits, the rates are just significantly even higher. So before the pandemic, this is about, again, November and December 2019, about 33% of SNAP recipients, which is SNAP is similar to formerly the food stamps program, reported using a food pantry. But in September and October, it moves to 65%, just showing that these benefits are not covering needs, the needs of New Yorkers right now. We also see that food pantry use and the CARES Act buffered against a dramatic increase in food hardship since the onset of the pandemic. Quickly, the CARES Act was the large, federal response to the pandemic that came into effect in March of 2020. And key to this analysis is that was the legislation that provided the original stimulus checks of $1,200 per adult. There were also people left out of that, and we can speak about that in the Q&A if anybody has any questions. But it also included the large expansions to unemployment insurance, including the $600 per week supplement that expired in late July, and pandemic emergency unemployment compensation and pandemic unemployment assistance, which both extended the coverage time and broadened definitions of covered workers under unemployment insurance. So it really kind of buffered the unemployment system, but just for a short period of time. And in our analysis, we're finding that the rates of food hardship were actually somewhat stable through the summer, where we see, about 34% of New Yorkers reporting that they were facing food hardship in those earlier months of the pandemic. Again, this is kind of after that big swell that we saw in early March, but again, we don't see a large increase in food hardship yet. The idea being that, the expanded coverage of pantries, as well as these large benefits provided through these policies, were somewhat leveling rates of food hardship. But since their expiration, we're seeing these significant rises in food hardship, such that in September and October, 42% of adults in the city were reporting that they were running out of food without money to buy more. Again, the policy response is even more evidenced in this slide, where we show the rates of food hardship before and after the expiration of the pandemic unemployment compensation, which is that $600 a week supplement to unemployment insurance. And we see that this side of the graph shows rates of food hardship among New Yorkers who lost work because of COVID, lost work or employment income, excuse me. We see that, in April to July, about 44% of New Yorkers in that group were reporting an experience of food hardship. And that rises to 53% after the expiration of that additional $600 payment. We also see on the other side that rates of food hardship appear to be declining among New Yorkers who have not lost work and have been stably employed, just showing how the pandemic is building on inequities that preceded this crisis, and it kind of expanding those inequities, right? Like people who are secure are saving more and have somewhat more financial security, while people who are struggling, it's just becoming harder and harder and harder over time. So I'll summarize those key findings again. The first is that food hardship has been a widespread problem in New York City for years, that this pandemic is just making worse. Before the pandemic, food pantries helped many New Yorkers get by in times of need, but since then they've become just an extreme lifeline for millions across the city. New York City's food pantries and the CARES Act buffered against a dramatic increase in food hardship in some of the earlier months of the pandemic, but with the expiration of key provisions in the CARES Act and the lag in the time it took to provide another round of federal stimulus, we were seeing a significant increase in food hardship. And policies that provide cash-based supports to New Yorkers are just key to staving off future increases in food hardship, according to our results. So thanks so much for your time. Now I stop. Oh.
Thanks, Sophie, for sharing with us. It's fascinating to, I guess, a little horrific bit of fascinating to see the numbers behind, what we've kind of experienced and seen, and to know that it is that rough right now. So thanks for sharing with us. Okay, so while I would love to dive into a million questions, I will also leave those for the discussion time. And for any who came in a little bit later, we will have a longer Q&A session at the end that we will be diving into the discussion questions. I want to make sure that everybody gets their adequate speaking time first. So I'm going to turn now to Karen Washington. Karen Washington is an activist and farmer who has been working for food justice for decades. Who began community gardening in the 1980s in the Bronx. Karen is the co-founder of Rise and Root Farm. Washington founded Farm School NYC and Black Urban Growers, and received a James Beard Foundation Leadership Award in 2014. She's also worked to transform the Bronx's empty lots into spaces where food can grow, helped launch a farmer's market, and relentlessly engaging her community has remained focused on the intersections of food and issues like poverty, racism, a lack of healthcare, and joblessness. So welcome, Karen.
Thank you so much for having me. I want to start off by just talking about my own experience in really looking at food security in communities of color. So I started this journey 30 years ago. And I can remember back in 1996, the World Food Summit defined food security as existing when all people at all times had access to sufficient, safe, nutritious food to maintain a healthy and active lifestyle. With that, many people were saying that people in poor urban and rural areas, if they wanted to have food security, all they had to do was eat some vegetables, grow some vegetables, give up soda and exercise. And if by magic, just by eating vegetables and drinking water, it was going to solve the problems in the food system without looking at the institutional and structural determinants that reinforce racism in today's society. So a question I ask time and time again as I go across the country and speak about food insecurity is why in the greatest country in the world, where we grow enough food and we waste enough food, that food is not getting back to the people that need it the most. And so some would say, well, it's the food system. The food system is broken and it needs to be fixed. And many of us would agree because I used to believe that too. I was drinking the Kool-Aid until I started to sort of look at the food system closely, peel back and realize that the struggle for healthy food and clean water brings to the surface the social economic disparities we often see in communities of color. And these disparities did not happen overnight. It started centuries ago. And so folks, I want to take you back on a little history trip because I had to find out, what is it about being poor? Are you born into being poor? And so just bear with me. After the Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation in 1865, free Black slaves had the opportunity to amass wealth through land ownership. In March of that year, General William T. Sherman signed a field order. It was Field Order 15, giving former slaves 400,000 acres of land. Just remember that, 400,000 acres of land. For the first time, Blacks went from slave workers to landowners. Yet, that promise of land to build wealth was short-lived. After the assassination of President Lincoln, President Andrew Johnson, now in office, revoked that order, which meant that the land that was promised to Blacks was now given back into the hands of slave owners. And I want you to sort of think about that. 400,000 acres of land to slaves so that they can amass wealth was taken away. And it was a spiral framework of racial and wealth inequalities ever since. dating from the Great Migration, when millions and millions of Blacks left the South, left what little land and wealth that they had, to the GI Bill. Imagine the GI Bill, where Blacks were coming back from World War I, World War II, the Korean War, and were denied mortgages and credits to buy homes, to the Federal Housing Act that participated in redlining, drawing a line so that Blacks can go into neighborhoods to buy homes, or were denied home ownership and were forced into ghettos. Or the dismal power of both the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, leaving Blacks with little or no access to build wealth, thus setting the stage for income inequality, poverty, and a food system in which the majority of land was owned by whites, still owned by whites, and the majority of farmers were white and still are white. Out of 57,000 white farmers here in New York State, only 139 are Black. And through it all, we now have an industrialized food complex that victimizes the poor through its subsidized charity-based food system. Long before COVID, folks, here in New York City, we would see lines and lines of people in underserved communities getting their food from soup kitchens and food pantries on a daily basis. We have known for quite a long time that this correlation between the food that we eat and our health, that unhealthy food winds up where? In poor neighborhoods, while healthy food go into affluent neighborhoods. And even though we ask people to eat healthy, the healthy, more nutritious food is expensive, while the food with little or no nutritional value is cheap. We know that there's a high incidence of diet-related diseases in poor communities. We have known these facts and statistics for decades. And frankly, folks, I'm tired of it. I'm tired of repeating myself. I'm tired of people using terms like food deserts. Oh, wait a second. No, it's food mirage. Oh, wait a second. I heard something totally different now. And so when people say these terms, they're outsider terms. They're outsider terms to note how people have access to food, where in fact we know we do have food. We have the junk food, we have the processed food, we have the fast food. So I coined the term food apartheid. And you say, wow, food apartheid, because I wanted people to stop, to think about the food system and to think about the food system in terms of race and social injustice, rather than using it as a political construct to focus on data, rather than focusing on the root causes. The impact of COVID-19 has magnified these inequalities. And although COVID is an equal opportunity virus, its devastation has occurred more in poor neighborhoods and neighborhoods of color. Today, more than ever, this virus has shown how important it is to be healthy and eat healthy. The time is now for us to have these hard conversations around race, economics, and power. Looking beyond COVID, we must ask ourselves, does the food system really need to be fixed? And I say no, it needs to change. And that change has to come from shifting power. But folks, people with power, they don't want that shift. For them, power is a drug. We have a food system that now has become a commodity based on profits and not on people. It's being used as a tool for people to have power over others. As people, we have even given up our power. Through silence and complacency, we have given up our power to big ag, to lobbyists, and to corporate America. We must shift our power. We must shift our power so that we have a system where there's more power within a community. We must shift the power dynamics of a food system that leaves the poor and communities of color powerless and victimized. We're always being seen with our hands out, never in the decision-making process with our hands in or a seat at the table. Change must start by giving up power. It's hard to do. It's a drug. But we have to do it because as long as we have a food system that embraces a power dynamic society of power over others, it will remain stagnant and resistant to change. Power must go back into the hands of the community. So what does that power shift look like in community? Well, we have to understand within our community what power is collectively, which means changing the way we view ourselves holistically and not how outsiders say or think we should be or who we are. Poor communities are often looked in terms of needs and deficits and scarcity and problems. We need to focus on our assets, our capabilities, our creativities, and solutions. We need to be asked what we want, not what we need. Asking a community what they need comes from a place of deficit. Asking them what they want comes from a position of power. We must value our social capital and communal wealth. What does that mean? Valuing social capital? It means that every person in this country has value, and collectively, we have the power to make change. We have made change at the ballot box. We can make change economically, hopefully with this new administration, by supporting a minimum wage that is fair and just, thus stimulating economic growth and wealth, eventually creating a food system that is just and fair, where people will be able to have land, to have a house, to build wealth. More than ever, this pandemic has forced us to redefine what community looks like. We now engage folks to focus on a local food economy, to support local businesses, small farms, farm workers, locally grown food. We have seen who are the essential workers. The essential workers are you and me and the people who live and work in our communities. Our food system on one hand is simple, the other hand is complex. There are dots along the way that we must connect. From the person that puts that seed in the ground to the food that's on our plate. Together, this food system is ours to take back. We all must play a role in building a healthy food system that is fair, just, and equitable. The time for talk is over. The time for us now is to roll up our sleeves and get to work. The question that I'm asking, and I'm asking as society, is who is willing to do that hard work? Thank you.
Oh, I feel, that was some powerful, powerful words. Thank you, Karen, for sharing what is both excellent analysis, but also a call to action and some concrete call to action of what we can get doing and how we need to act now and make this better. So thank you so much for sharing. We turn now to our third of our panelists for the night, Liz Accles. Liz Accles is the executive director of the Community Food Advocates, a New York City-based organization that uses advocacy, organizing, and coalition building grounded in solid policy and budget analysis to improve New Yorkers' access to food. Accles has worked on public policy issues relating to poverty and hunger since 1991 on the city, state, and federal levels. She is a policy person deeply interested and engaged in coalition building and organizing. So welcome, Liz.
Thanks. I appreciate the opportunity to be here and be on the panel with Sophie and Karen. I'm going to tell you a little bit about our organization and talk about our work, and then turn to the New York City's response to the COVID pandemic and the increase in the already dramatic food insecurity in New York City. So, you know, one of the things that became apparent during the, as COVID hit, one of the things nationally in New York City was what was going to happen if schools closed, and where were children going to be able to access food? Now, that's, you know, if you look to Karen's point, like this is many layers. This is like an immediate thing with many layers behind it, right? But the bottom line is the school food program provides 30 million meals a year to students. It's a federal guarantee, meaning that federal money for every child that wants to eat, you know, and participates, the government gets reimbursed, and the localities get reimbursed. So we focus on, one of the issues we focus on is the school food program. We spearhead a coalition called the Lunch for Learning campaign, and we fought successfully to get universal free school lunch in New York City, with the idea being that many kids who are, like 75% of children in New York City public schools are eligible previously for free school lunch. A third of them weren't participating because of the stigma and poverty shame associated with the program. And, you know, for households that are struggling day to day to pay the rent, to meet food needs, that if a child eats and is comfortable and happy eating meals in school, that's 40 meals a month. So we focus on that. New York City school food is the biggest in the country, serving 900,000 meals a day. So it has a huge reach, and has for many, many generations. So as COVID hit, this question came up: what happens if the schools closes? What happens to kids? Again, this was certainly true in New York City, but this is a national question. Urban, rural, suburban, huge question. And in New York City, we didn't know what was going to happen until like a few days before. And, you know, I'm an advocate, so my job is to push and watchdog and bring out problems. And I'm pleased to say the city did an extraordinary job. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about that, and as it ties into emergency food. So basically, they created, you know, they mobilized the largest single food distribution network in the city, the school food system, that's used to serving 900,000 meals a day. There's nothing that matches that in scale. It's only second in size to the US military, to make sure people could get food, because there was an immediate crisis that was going to be happening. So they basically, after a few weeks, they had food in all schools as they were developing the program initially. They then set up sites in 500 sites throughout the city, serving 3 meals a day, 5 days a week for families to take home. No identification, nothing required. You could pick up for anyone as many meals as you need. And although this is not the way people should have to be able to guarantee that they're going to have food, the question of families who are, where there's food hardship or food insecure, don't know where the food is coming from the next day, the next week, the next month, which is a huge number of people. At least we knew the city was going to guarantee, and this is before the feds even said, we support this, that that people can get food 5 days a week, 3 meals a day. So that was pretty extraordinary. At its peak, that was serving 600,000 meals a day, and it's still in place, and I'll talk a little bit about that. In addition, the city did Catherine Garcia, who's the commissioner, who was the commissioner of the Department of Sanitation, and is known as an operations guru, was named the food czar. And she looked at a lot of different things, including transportation of food into the city, all kinds of things like that. But one of the big gaps is that the school food-based response of 600,000 meals a day, what happens with people who are medically vulnerable and shouldn't be out and about? And they set up this system. And to me, this is an example, a prime example of if government moves quickly with creativity, there's the potential to have a huge impact. They started a program from scratch because there was no home delivered meals program that the city was running of a significant size. They basically contract with a bunch of vendors. They used Uber type technology where folks could sign up, and they made a relationship with the Taxi and Limousine Commission, out of work taxi drivers, for people to sign up. It was, you just attested that you didn't have money for food or anyone to go buy it for you, and they had 3 days worth of food for 2 people in the household delivered, and this is still happening. And this started from scratch, and within months they were serving 600,000 meals a day there. Again, I say this as a very usually cynical advocate. That is, to me, is there's a lot of talk about the ineffectiveness of government, and nothing has the reach and the resources in the broadest way as strong government programs. And we've seen the erosion of government programs and investment in government programs and the impact it has. So when there's creativity and resources and innovation put in place, it could be extraordinary. Where this is different from emergency food providers is that what we saw early in the pandemic, a lot of emergency food providers shutting down because they're volunteer-based, many seniors running them. The medical vulnerability was extraordinary. And here you have a unionized workforce. There were health concerns because there wasn't enough PPE. But people who are paid and staffed to run this operation. So in terms of both the school and the home delivered meals. So our role, I'm not sure of my timing. Can you give me a sense of where I am?
I think we're probably about like 3 to 5 minutes.
Okay, so our role, so the Lunch for Learning campaign, we're the group that fought for universal free lunch and have stayed together for about 7 years, and made up of public school parents, students, the 3 school-based unions, DC 37, who represents cafeteria workers, the United Federation of Teachers, and the Principals Union, American Academy of Pediatrics, and, as I mentioned, parent leaders from throughout the city. And we pivoted right away because we were like, the city's doing, is doing what they should be doing from a public policy point of view, but we wanted to make sure it was everyone that could access food, no questions asked, that people could take, it wasn't like mom or dad or another adult in the household, you could pick up food for neighbors, that kind of thing. We got sites expanded. So within our network throughout the entire city, we got fed in information about what was going on. We get together every few weeks and just sharing what and there's a guy named Chris Tricarico who runs a school food program, who is extraordinarily open and transparent and wanting to hear things, which is not often the case, and not defensive. And we've really been able to help in that. Now, just to say, there's policy and there's implementation. So at the peak, there was 600,000 meals a day. Now, New York City public schools serve 900,000 meals a day, about 650,000 lunches and about 250,000 breakfasts. Right now, we have 400,000 meals per day being served. Again, it's 3 days, 3 meals a day, 5 days a week. So we know that those numbers are not reaching the immediate need. And so, what we do is try to figure out and the number of sites have been expanded to almost all schools for households with school-age children. So we push the city on ways to make sure, things that may seem obvious, like about signage and about, and we're getting that fed in from, so we look for thematic things and individual things places where people are being turned away, that kind of thing. So just to, that's a little bit of what's happening there. Some bit of good news is that because of the pandemic, the USDA, who runs the school food program, has provided waivers to every school district in the country to basically do universal free school lunch. There's free meals for all students, all children. It's basically the summer meals model, without me getting into what that is. And so this has opened up an opportunity. New York City is one of the biggest cities doing universal free school lunch, and it's happening in a bunch of other cities. But everyone, I'm sure, has heard stories of lunch shaming and kids being turned away from lunch because their parents can't pay the fee. That kind of stuff. Or told to do chores, or marked on their hands, or given a cheese sandwich instead of something else. And the only way to do that is to, we've had a school food system that structurally has divided children by income for 40 years in the cafeteria, and it's marked the program as a poverty program. Yep, and so different color tickets. And this impacts kids where there's a wide range of income levels. It also impacts kids in the lowest income schools, because kids, like adults, will decide who has a little bit more and who doesn't, and torment each other. So lots of kids, despite the need, a third of the kids in New York City public schools before universal who were eligible were not participating. That's 250,000 kids. So the hopeful news is that with the Biden-Harris administration and with a democratically controlled House and Senate, and with this issue popping up all over the place about lunch shaming from school districts throughout the country, that there's some momentum for national universal free school lunch movement. So we're really hopeful for that. We hope you'll keep an eye out for it. I realize I'm short on time. I was going to talk about the good food purchasing policy work that we're doing. We spearhead a campaign. I don't want to go that. I'll take 1 minute to describe it. That basically looks to harness the enormous food procurement power that New York City government has. New York City serves 230 million meals a year. That's an extraordinary amount of money and resources to impact the local and regional food economies in the areas of local economies, worker rights, environmental sustainability, nutrition of the 230 million meals served, and animal welfare. And this is happening in a bunch of different cities. New York City is implementing it. We run this a coalition that is leading the efforts in New York City, and with racial equity at the core of the work around local economies, worker rights, the meals that are served, and so on. So I did very short shrift there. So I apologize, but trying not to hog up the time. Thank you.
No worries. And it looks like Brett was tossing some links in the chat there as well for folks who want to find out a little bit more. So Liz, thank you. And thank you for also giving us maybe a little bit of some story of hope in the midst of all this and in the midst of the year that we've had. So it is now time to turn to our kind of Q&A discussion time. And so I did see a couple of things in the chat. So let me just pull that open real quick. And it looked like Diana, I could either read those or we could unmute you, whatever would work well. And then I see a hand from Melanie. So let me, there we go.
Okay. I just want to ask, has anybody done a study on the connection between the reduction of farms that are not run as big businesses and the increase in prisons in upstate New York? Because my understanding is that most of the people who work for the prisons, which we're trying to reduce, like to get rid of them, they came from the farming industry. Has anybody done any work on that? Also, how do we do it? How do we get these horrible toxins out of our food? The toxins that are, even if something is labeled organic, it could be in a field where something's not organic and it could have toxins in it. And they use language like they say natural flavors. Natural flavors could be something that's absolutely not natural nor good for your health. So there's a lot of the industry that is I'm concerned about. And I'm also wondering, you know, we have a strike of important group of workers coming on board recently. The whole issue of salary is very important for workers in the food industry and unions. For example, you know, there are many big industries that don't have any unions for their staff. And then again, in the supermarkets. And also, I think what was the other question I had put in the chat? It was about
It was about COVID, the prices of food going up.
Oh, I want to know if there's been a study that can tell us how much the increase in the prices is for everybody, for healthy and unhealthy food since the COVID, because I suspect it's been substantial. But I don't see any studies on that or anybody fighting back on that. Is there a way to fight back? You know, I'm not sure. Because, for example, I'm an older person. Tuesday, they give a 10% discount at Christini's. It's practically nothing.
Okay, so let's see. Let's see who might have.
And I wondered about Working Families Party. Has anybody been involved with them? Because they're the next to the Democrats. They're the big deal here.
So Sophie, Karen, Liz, feel free to.
I'm going to answer that question because she asks a lot of questions. And like I said from the very beginning, we've lost our power. We've been silent and complacent. And the only way you're going to see change is collectively asking those change and making sure that people who are your representative are accountable. I mean, you know, I do a homework assignment with students and I ask them to go into a supermarket and ask them exactly where this produce come from. You know what some of the produce managers say when the students ask them? Oh, it's from the truck. And so again, we have to start having those hard conversations. It's not one person, it's not on data, it's getting a group of people and starting to ask for change, ask questions. I don't understand what has happened to us. Why have we sat back and expect things to happen without being proactive and asking and doing things? You ask good questions, Diane. I'm just saying you ask excellent questions. I'm just throwing it out to the universe.
Yeah. Liz, Sophie, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
I have, go ahead.
Go ahead, Sophie.
I have like, not a like data as advocacy comment, but something that's somewhat related to the price question, which there has been some, I think, reporting on. There's also, you know, what I would be interested in seeing and would love to look into is, you know, variation in pricing by neighborhood within supermarkets, just like what the price is of like a box of cereal at like a supermarket based on neighborhood, and just see like those variations. But more important, not more important, but similarly, what we have seen over time is that there has been a reduction in prices of food for high-end products, while the cost of less expensive food products or lower, and you know, has remained pretty stagnant. And that actually has big implications on the poverty measure through some very technical aspects, which then in turn affects like allocation of resources to neighborhoods. So while it seems like a small thing, it has wide-ranging implications. And just like Karen was saying, it has implications about power and the allocation of resources across the country. So it's a really good question because of those connections, which are somewhat in the weeds, but
Yep. I mean, you asked a whole bunch of questions, but the fact that prisons are an industry and you know, have grown more and more into an industry in rural counties is you know, hugely, it becomes you know, this cycle of income, and people from the city, people of color mostly from the city, you know, that to keep the economy buoyed in those areas requires mass imprisonment. And you know, that's a huge I mean, I don't know how to say anything about that without it being an understatement. It's a huge structural problem, a long time in the making, and that needs to be addressed, from what it means for New York City residents and what it means for folks, you know, making sure there are alternatives economically in rural counties upstate.
Thank you all three for that. I see, looks like we have Melanie has a hand raised. I don't see on your screen now. Melanie, are you still nearby? We'll get you unmuted. Give us just a second. And there we go.
Okay there. Hi. Thank you very much for great presentations. My question could be answered, I guess, by anybody, but I particularly would like to ask Karen. Karen, I'm in my 60s, and I remember, my question is about historical perspective from, let's say, where we are in 220, say 1980 or so. I remember different things happening in the city, not about food, because I wasn't aware of food, but of community involvement in community gardens and community building. People, a wonderful place in the Bronx with the word casa in it. Wonderful things where communities were building up. And I've seen that kind of thing, or I've seemed to see that kind of thing either gone or co-opted by gentrification. And I'm wondering, not only, I'm wondering what you know, if you do know anything, about what was happening in the city then that enabled those things to happen. And are there things that we could use now, in your perspective?
Thanks for asking that question. I'm 66 years of age, so I grew
Me
up
too.
in the civil rights movement, the war in Vietnam. And so, I mean, you know, early on, you saw activism, again, silent complacency as people, you know, got tired of marching and things changing, things not changing. You know, people became silent and complacent. However, I would like to say, as Black Lives Matter, you're starting to see this whole young movement now coming to the forefront, demanding change. For the first time, everybody, you know, a lot of people are becoming excited. What I'm excited about, hopefully with the Biden administration, if they put forth a $15 an hour wage. Okay, folks, $15 an hour wage. That means a person makes between $30,000 and $40,000 a year, right? Two households, that's between $70,000 and $80,000 a year. Four people, so you have two adults and you maybe have a 18-year-old and a 20-year-old. That's almost $140,000 a year. Can you imagine what that would do? They don't have to be on food pantries and soup kitchens. They can buy houses. They can pay for an education. These are the things that I am excited about. Hopefully that can happen, because at the end of the day, granted, I love food pantries and soup kitchens. They do a marvelous work. But at the end of the day, They are supposed to be for emergency purposes like now, post-COVID. I want to see economic stimulus that $15 an hour could change the outlook of people owning homes, owning businesses, getting out of poverty. That's what I'm excited about. Because for me, it's always about, for me, living in a low-income neighborhood of color. I live in the Bronx. Out of 62 counties in New York State, the Bronx ranks 62 as the most unhealthiest. I want to see financial responsibility, education, entrepreneurship, job ownership. That's what I want to see. And I don't want to see welfare. I don't want to see SNAP. I don't want to see food pantries. And I don't want to see soup kitchens. And I'm sorry I have to say that. I want to see empowerment. I want to see my community that's rich with ownership and entrepreneurship instead of being pushed out to the side when people with power and privilege come in and push us out of our neighborhoods.
One second, Melanie, I see your hand is raised for follow-up here. And then we have one question from Brett in the chat, and then just to honor our 8 o'clock commitment, I will.
Okay, Karen, what I'm wondering is, was in the communities that were doing this building up, I'm not talking about the activism and the protests and the we need. It seemed to me that there were people building, that there were people saying, I have, and I can contribute, and I can share. It seemed to me then that there was, maybe not a lot in my little privileged place, but that there was some. And I'm wondering, was there?
Yes, and they sold out. End of conversation.
Okay, got you. Thank you. That's what I wanted to know.
Okay, so as a final question here, and then if we have commitment from everybody, we can stick around for another minute or two, but as a final kind of wrap-up question, what steps can we take as individuals to lessen this issue? And then also as Fourth Universalist, as an organization, what steps should we take as an organization to make more positive change in this area of food insecurity in our communities? And if you need to see that written out, Brett has it in the chat.
Weigh in with your elected officials. You know, there are going to be things, you know, coming up on the federal level. Things are pretty desperate budget-wise on the city, you know, in the state and city level, that hopefully will get some relief from the federal government. But just to pay attention to things that will have a big impact. You know, whether it's the $15 an hour minimum wage, universal free school lunch, like there are things that we could be striving for and should be striving for. And, you know, I think this pandemic has shown economic vulnerability in ways, you know, that we haven't seen in an extraordinary amount of time, and the lack of infrastructure to make sure people don't just, you know, people that fallen through the cracks for a long time, and then more and more people just falling through the cracks. And that's something to pay attention to. And there are things happening, thankfully.
A connection to the $15 minimum wage law and proposal that I think would be interesting to focus on is how it relates to the tax system and the tax credits that people are still like very much left out of while earning a $15 minimum wage. So we have in certain ways a regressive tax system, and that interaction is really problematic. So it's like, how do we make sure that, as Karen was saying, that that wages are higher and that it's matched in the tax system the same way that it is for higher income earners, because you don't want to be eating away at it, which like in turn happens without that consciousness.
And Karen, I saw yours in the chat. I can read that, or if you wanted to share it. But but to be proactive instead of reactive. That is some solid advice for this moment. And as a quick share from my end here, we do have another event next week at the same time, same place, talking about food waste and composting. And Brett is posting some links for you as well. We did write out some ideas as far as like next steps, action steps, and we will be able to get those being emailed out to you. Things like supporting your local food bank, finding community fridges in your neighborhood and asking how you can donate. Learn more about and consider supporting the Black Farmer Fund. Learn more about and consider supporting the Northeast Farmers of Color. And so those are going to be also coming out in an email. This is going to be written up in, or it's going to be made into podcast and video forms. And this has also been on YouTube Live as well. So we have lots of opportunities that if you want to be enjoying this in a different way, that you can hop on and listen to this over again, listen to some of this insight. And so we have those links in the chat. And I want to thank you all for all of your time, and thank you to all of our guests for coming, as well as our guests that attended as well. So Liz, Sophie, Karen, those were amazing presentations. I really feel like I came away with tons of new knowledge and ideas on how to really enact change tonight. So we're really blessed to have you share with us tonight. Thank you much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you to Soyal and Ember for making this all happen behind the scenes and on screen. Thanks to all our panelists.
Thanks.